Hello everybody, it's Logan Albright here, and I want to talk about this book that I just finished reading called The Turn of the Key. This is a thriller by Ruth Ware, and it's about a nanny who goes to take a live-in position with a family in a remote part of Scotland. It's a pretty tight, pretty compelling thriller, but the main thing I want to talk to you about today is the framing device that the author uses and framing devices in general. A framing device is any kind of external justification story besides just having a story for its own sake. So for example, in the Arabian Nights, the framing device is that Scheherazade has to keep telling these stories to the Sultan or else he's going to kill her unless she keeps him entertained. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, the framing device is that Dr. Watson is writing down these cases that he and Sherlock have solved for posterity. It's a very commonly seen device, especially in novels of the 19th century, where you have a lot of this was a manuscript that was found in an abandoned castle, and I collected it and edited it and published it. You see a lot of those kind of framing devices. It's less popular nowadays, which is maybe why this book in particular drew my attention to that device, because you just don't see it as much anymore. But I do think it can be effective, but you got to be careful, and you don't want to misuse it in ways that will distract your reader from the story. So that's what a framing device is, and the one that the author uses in this book is that a woman is writing letters or a letter to her a lawyer from prison asking for help with her case. Now that sounds like a reasonable enough framing device, but I don't think it's entirely successful in this case, and I want to talk about why and what I think authors need to do to be careful when using framing devices. First of all, I have to acknowledge that any kind of fictional story is by its very nature a contrivance. The device of the omniscient narrator, where you have someone telling a story who has access to the innermost thoughts and feelings of every single character, is obviously unrealistic. We have to suspend disbelief when we read stories like that. But it's something we've come to accept and expect as readers, and I don't think it is a problem. But there are things you have to be careful about when you're using a framing device. For example, if you're writing a first-person narrative where the narrator is the main character in the story, you can't have that character die during the course of the story, because then how did it get written down? How did the story get told if the person telling it is dead before the story ends? It doesn't work. It breaks us out of our suspension of disbelief, and it ruins the immersive quality of the story. Now, in this particular case, writing letters, it seems like a reasonable enough device, but the thing you have to remember when you're writing a letter is that it has to feel like a letter. And this is where I think this book falls down, is the book is 300 and something pages long, and it all is written in the form of a letter from a woman in prison to a lawyer. So we're expected to believe that she's written 300 pages of letter while anxiously awaiting trial. Not only 300 pages of letter, but lots of little asides and excruciating little details that you would not include in a letter to a lawyer if you were actually writing it. Lots of reports of direct speech, things you couldn't possibly remember. For example, we're expected to believe that she has remembered word for word everything that anyone has said to her over the past months, several weeks, and has written them down word for word because she uses quotation marks. For example, when she goes to interview for the nanny position, she might say something like, the host said, "Do you want a cup of tea? I offer you something." And I said, "Yes, that would be lovely. Let's sit down and talk about it." If you were actually writing a letter, you wouldn't report direct speech like that. You would just say, "Oh, she offered me a cup of tea and I accepted." That's all you would say. You wouldn't actually try to get word-for-word recreation of what people were saying. This may seem like nitpicking, and to a certain extent it is, but I think you can forgive some of these things if the author allows you to forget about them and become immersed in the story. If she mentioned the framing device at the very beginning of the story and didn't mention it again until the end, we could forget about it, and we could just let the whole thing flow as a story without the framing device and forget about all those little details, and then at the end be reminded, "Oh yeah, this is a letter, I forgot about that." But in this case, she doesn't do that. She keeps reminding you every 20 or 30 pages, every couple chapters, "Oh, I'm writing this letter to my lawyer," and she keeps using the guy's name. And so it kind of is this tonal shift that's a little bit jarring, where you go back and forth between what seems like a normal story where someone is telling a first-person narrative and reporting direct speech and using a lot of really involved detail that you wouldn't include in a letter that you were writing out, presumably by hand, to this, "Oh, I'm in prison, you need to help me remember that." That shift in those two different tones comes back and forth over and over again, and I found it really broke me out of the realism of the story. The other thing you need to consider with the framing device is, why is it there in the first place? Why do you need it? Why can't you just tell the story as a story? In this case, there was no reason for the framing device at all. The story wouldn't have suffered in the slightest bit, in my opinion, if it had just been told as a first-person narrative by the nanny and no framing device, no letters from prison, no lawyer. You never actually meet the lawyer or see him or have anything to do with him. So what's the point of that? You could just go through it as a regular story and it wouldn't create these kind of problems. I kept thinking to myself, how is she remembering word for word what everyone has said to her, writing it down in perfect detail with even things like hesitations, ums and ahs and ers included. Why would you do that? You wouldn't if you were writing a letter. That doesn't make any sense. But if you were telling the story from an omniscient narrator standpoint, or as a first-person narrative from within the mind of the narrator, you can forgive those kind of things because we're used to that kind of story. But jumping back and forth between the framing device of writing the letters and the story as a story, I found very jarring. So if there's no reason for a framing device, don't include one. Just write the story as a story. You have to have a good justification for putting it in, especially if it's going to create a distraction for the reader and drag the reader out of the immersive quality of the story, so that they are, instead of wondering what's going to happen next, they're questioning the writing style, or they're questioning how this could have happened that way. I think that can be a real failing of writers, where what you want is for your reader to be undistracted and completely engrossed in the story. And anything that creates those kind of distractions, I think, is to be avoided unless you have a good reason. All that having been said, I did enjoy the book. It was highly engrossing. I got through it very quickly because I wanted to know what happened. I found the ending a little bit unsatisfying, but I don't want to get into that because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who might want to read it. But I wanted to take the opportunity to just address that concept, that tradition of framing devices, and give a little bit of my thoughts and a little bit of advice on how you could use it effectively, or the kind of pitfalls you can fall into when you're trying to use it. So if you're looking for a fun, fast-paced thriller, I can recommend The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, with a little bit of reservation, just bearing in mind that framing device of writing letters from prison is not only unnecessary, but in my opinion, a little bit distracting from the text. Thanks for watching, everybody. I've been Logan Albright, and I'll catch you next time.